There is a plant growing along the north wall of your house right now that is worth more, pound for pound, in a supermarket 6,000 miles away than almost anything else in that yard. It has been there for 2 decades. Nobody watered it on purpose this spring. Nobody fertilized it. Nobody has ever once thought about it as food. And yet in the last week of April, while the rest of the garden is still bare dirt and seed packets waiting on the last frost, this one plant is already standing at full harvest height, pale, tightly coiled, and exactly the size a farmer 6,000 miles away would be looking for. In a grocery store in Yamagata, that same plant sells wrapped in plastic, stickered with a brand name, sitting in the produce case as the first vegetable of the new season, with its own cooperative, its own harvest window, and its own regional reputation. In an American garden center, the very same species sells as a shade-loving border plant, prized mainly for how well it keeps the slugs away. Same genus, same species, in many yards, 2 completely unrelated lives. And the gap between them has nothing to do with flavor, and nothing to do with safety. It comes down to 2 men, working roughly 30 years apart, who each looked at this plant and quietly decided that only one half of it was worth putting on a boat. If you like finding out that something sitting in plain sight has a hidden identity, stay for this one, and go ahead and hit like and subscribe with notifications on now, because the next part of this story involves a smuggled plant collection, a U.S. Marshal working as a plant scout, and a poison that looks almost exactly like the vegetable does. Let's start with what's actually growing in that shade bed. The plant is a Hosta, almost certainly Hosta montana, sometimes sold as the large leaf or mountain Hosta. If you've ever planted a border of Hostas along a fence or a foundation, you already own this genus. There are entire garden centers built around it. But in Japan, before the leaves unfurl, before the plant becomes the thing Americans recognize, the young shoot has its own name, its own season, and its own market, Urui. Urui belongs to a category the Japanese call sansai, literally mountain vegetables, the wild and semi-wild plants that push up through the last snowmelt in the mountains of the Tohoku region and signal that winter has finally let go. Sansai aren't a single crop. They're a whole seasonal category, and cooks and foragers track each one the way a birdwatcher tracks migration dates, because the window to catch them at their best is short, and it does not wait for anyone. Foragers and farmers cut urui shoots 7 to 10 days after they break the soil, while the leaf is still rolled into a tight pale spear, before it opens and toughens. Cut any later and you've missed the window. The plant moves on to being an ornamental leaf, not a vegetable, and once that shift happens, there's no going back for that shoot. The taste, by most accounts, sits somewhere between asparagus and a mild butter lettuce, with a faint, mucilaginous quality similar to young okra. Raw, chilled, and dressed with sesame and bonito flakes, it's a standard spring side dish. Battered, it becomes tempura. Sliced into miso soup, it adds a green, slightly bitter note that Japanese cooks associate specifically with the turn of the season. According to Japan's standard food composition tables, 100 grams of raw urui contains roughly 19 calories, about 50 milligrams of vitamin C, close to what you'd get from an orange, along with meaningful potassium, folate, and beta-carotene, and enough vitamin K to cover a full day's requirement in a single serving. In Yamagata Prefecture specifically, growers have turned this into a specialty product. In late autumn, they lift dormant hosta crowns out of the field and move them into dark greenhouses, where the shoots are forced to grow without light. Starved of sunlight, the stems come up pale, almost white, and so tender they're eaten raw. That version has its own trade name, Yuki Urui, snow urui, and it commands a premium price as a delicacy, not a garden weed. So somewhere between a Japanese farmer's greenhouse and an American front yard, the exact same plant took 2 entirely different paths. To understand why, you have to go back to a walled-off Dutch trading post in the 1820s. In 1823, a German physician named Philipp Franz von Siebold arrived at Dejima, an artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor, and, at the time, essentially the only legal point of contact between Japan and the West. Japan was closed to foreigners under the Sakoku policy. Trade was tightly restricted, movement was watched, and a European resident like Siebold was allowed to exist there only under very narrow conditions. He used the position as cover for something much bigger than medicine. Over roughly 6 years, Siebold quietly built what would become the largest collection of Japanese plants and animals any European had assembled up to that point, cataloging specimens most Western botanists had never even heard described. In 1829, Japanese authorities discovered he had acquired maps of the coastline, forbidden material, treated as an act of espionage, and placed him under house arrest before expelling him from the country entirely. By any reasonable expectation, that should have been the end of his collection too. It wasn't. He left anyway, and he took the collection with him. By 1830, Siebold had settled in Leiden, in the Netherlands, and turned that smuggled botanical hall into a business, selling Japanese plants to European gardens and nurseries. Among the species he introduced to the West were hostas, marketed purely as ornamental foliage. There's no record suggesting anyone in Leiden asked what the Japanese actually did with the young shoots. As far as European horticulture was concerned, the plant existed from the leaf up. 3 decades later, an American did almost the same thing, on purpose, with government backing. Thomas Hogg Jr. was born in London in 1820, raised in New York, and came from a family that ran one of the region's earliest commercial nurseries. In 1862, President Lincoln appointed him a U.S. Marshal and posted him to the American consulate in Japan, where he stayed for 7 years. During that time, Hogg quietly shipped native Japanese plants back to his family's nursery in New York and to a Long Island nurseryman named Samuel Parsons, who propagated and sold them to American gardeners. By 1880, Parsons was crediting Hogg with introducing more new Japanese plant material to the United States than any collector since the famous plant hunter Robert Fortune. Among Hogg's most valuable introductions were variegated hostas, cultivars with white or cream streaks running through the green leaf. One still carries his name in the trade today. And here's the detail that tends to get lost. Neither Siebold nor Hogg was hiding the fact that this plant was edible in Japan. They simply weren't in the vegetable business. They were nurserymen, and a variegated leaf sold for more money than a plain green one. So the ornamental traits crossed the ocean, and the culinary tradition stayed behind, because nobody moving the plant westward had any commercial reason to move the recipe with it. Here's your check-in point, because the story is about to shift from history into something a lot closer to home, specifically into your own backyard. And there's a decent chance your own hostas have been trying to tell you this for years. If that sounds worth sticking around for, now's a good moment to like and subscribe so the rest of this doesn't get lost in your feed. American plant breeders spent the next century finishing what Hogg started. Today, there are roughly 7,000 named Hosta cultivars in circulation. The American Hosta Society, the official registration authority for the genus, describes it as the most widely planted perennial in the temperate United States, and the National Garden Bureau went as far as naming 2024 the Year of the Hosta. Flip through any modern nursery catalog and the breeding priorities are stated outright. Thick leaf substance, heavy waxy coating, deep corrugation, and, this is the important one, strong slug resistance. One catalog listing even advertises that the leaf's toughness is what keeps slugs away. Read that closely, and what it's actually saying is that generations of breeders selected an originally edible Asian vegetable specifically for the trait of becoming unpalatable. And it worked. On slugs. It did not work on deer. And if you've ever gardened in deer country, you already know exactly which plant gets hit first every single night. The North Carolina Cooperative Extension flatly lists hostas under the nickname deer candy. Michigan State University Extension goes further, noting that deer will actively seek hostas out and select them over many of the surrounding plants in the same bed, rather than just eating whatever happens to be nearby. The University of Connecticut's Home and Garden Education Center connects the two threads directly. Their bulletin points out that the young leaves are traditionally eaten in Japan, raw, boiled, or fried as tempura, and then states plainly that this same underlying palatability is exactly why deer treat the plant as a snack in the first place. Every extension office fighting this problem has been quietly documenting the same fact for years, just never in the direction most homeowners were listening for. The deer in your yard have been reading the plant correctly the entire time. You've just been buying repellent spray to argue with them. And there's one more twist tucked into this same region of Japan. Sometime between 1912 and 1926, a hosta, with striking cream and gold leaf margins, turned up in a private garden in Saga City, which sits inside the Yamagata Basin, the same basin where farmers grow Yuki Urui as a commercial crop. That ornamental cultivar was formally registered in 1996 under the name Sagai, after the city. It went on to win the Royal Horticultural Society's Award of Garden Merit in 1993, and in 2000, the American Hosta Growers Association named it Hosta of the Year. Saga City now lists it as the municipality's official plant, so the exact same basin produced both a nationally decorated ornamental hosta and a commercially farmed spring vegetable, and American horticulture imported only the trophy. Now, before anyone goes outside and starts eating leaves off the nearest hosta, there's a genuinely important safety detail, and it's the exact reason foraging urui in the wild is treated with real caution in Japan, not as a casual weekend activity. Two native false hellebore species, both in the genus Veratrum, send up young shoots in early spring that closely resemble hosta shoots at the exact same growth stage. Same pale coiled shape, same general size, emerging in the same weeks, in the same kind of shaded, damp ground. To an inexperienced eye, and sometimes even to an experienced one, the two can be genuinely difficult to tell apart in that first week above ground. False hellebore contains steroidal alkaloids, and consuming it can cause vomiting, disturbed or blurred vision, a dangerously slowed heart rate, and a sharp drop in blood pressure. A serious medical emergency, not a mild stomach upset. Japanese poison control centers record mix-ups between the two plants every spring, almost without fail, which is exactly why experienced foragers are taught to never harvest urui from an unfamiliar patch without absolute certainty of the plant's identity. That risk applies specifically to wild foraging, where you're relying on a quick glance at a shoot pushing up through leaf litter, with no way to know its full history. It's a completely different situation with a hosta you planted yourself, years ago, from a nursery tag you can probably still find in a kitchen drawer. There's no guessing involved. You know exactly what species is in the ground, because you're the one who put it there. If you do decide to try it, the traditional method is straightforward, but a handful of details actually matter, and skipping any of them changes the outcome. Timing comes first. Harvest the shoots 7 to 10 days after they break the surface, while the leaf is still rolled tight into that pale spear shape. Once it unfurls into a flat green leaf, the texture turns fibrous and tough, the flavor shifts, and the window has closed for that particular shoot. You're simply looking at next year's foliage at that point, not a vegetable. How much you take matters just as much as when. Work from the outer edge of an established clump rather than the center, and leave the middle crown completely untouched, since that's where the plant's future growth is concentrated. A reasonable guideline used by foragers is to take no more than about a third of the shoots from any single plant in a season. Handled that way, an established hosta keeps producing the following spring exactly as it always has. The harvest barely registers to the plant. Preparation is where the traditional method earns its reputation, and it isn't optional. Before eating the shoots, blanch them in boiling water for 30 to 90 seconds. That step exists for a specific reason. Hostas contain saponins, the same bitter, soap-like compounds that get rinsed off raw quinoa before cooking. And they're also the reason poison control resources list raw hostas as mildly toxic to dogs and cats if chewed in quantity. Saponins are water-soluble, so a short, hard boil pulls the bulk of them out of the tissue. After that quick blanch, the shoots can be shocked in cold water, chilled and dressed with sesame and a splash of soy, dropped straight into a pot of miso soup, or battered and fried as tempura, all standard preparations in Yamagata kitchens every spring. One rule sits above all the others, and it's non-negotiable. Only ever harvest from a hosta you know hasn't been treated with systemic insecticide or synthetic fertilizer. Those products can be absorbed into the plant's own tissue, and no amount of blanching removes them. If you've ever sprayed the bed, that particular plant is off the menu. Which brings us back to that shade bed, wherever yours happens to be. Late April, the shoots pushing up along the fence line, pale at the base, tightly furled, cool to the touch, structurally identical, right down to the shape and the timing, to what a buyer in a Yamagata market would be looking for the exact same week. The soil is the same soil that's been there for 20 years. The plant hasn't changed a single thing about itself. The only difference between a vegetable and a garden border, in this case, is a decision made almost 200 years ago by men who were in the business of selling foliage, not food, and who never had a reason to ask a Japanese farmer what the shoot underneath that leaf was actually for. The nursery tag in the drawer says ornamental. It always has. But the plant itself has never once agreed with that description. It's simply been growing along the north wall of houses across an entire country, decade after decade, waiting for someone to look at it the way a farmer in Tohoku already does every spring. So take one more look at that border along your house. Would you actually cut a shoot and try it? Or does it stay exactly where it's always been? As a plant you walk past instead of one you'd put on a plate? Let me know in the comments, and if this is the kind of thing you like digging into. Ordinary things with a history nobody tells you about. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there's another one of these hiding in plain sight coming soon.